And I just kept hearing over and over about the movie Smile and that it was really good and there's a bunch of hype around it all over TikTok. And this movie was really hyped, which usually means it's not going to be a great film, but I have been surprised by films before, so I don't really try to hold that against a movie. I thought the premise seemed interesting enough. I love horror movies, but when I got into it, I just realized that this film is just a mashup of several better films, along with a little bit of a creepypasta. But I just have to say, the plot of this film is so closely lifted from The Ring, and then the other movie that I think it heavily takes elements from is the movie It Follows. And then the creepypasta, The Smiling Man, is kind of thrown in there. And a lot of people have seen The Smiling Man. It's a very popular creepypasta. There's a very popular adaptation of it on YouTube that has millions of views, and it goes viral every couple years. So there's a lot of things I really disliked about this film, but I do have to say before we go any further, there are a couple things about this film that I did enjoy. So I'm a filmmaker and cinematographer myself, and I really did appreciate the cinematography in the film. Sometimes I don't know how original it was, but I did really enjoy the camera work. I thought a lot of it was good, but there was a major flaw of the cinematography in that there are almost no close-ups in this film. Like, I'm talking almost everything is a wide shot, a medium close-up at the closest. I really believe when you're making a horror film, part of the way you make the audience feel horror is by getting up close, letting us see the actors' emotions. And this film really does not do that. As far as I can remember, the only extreme close-up in the entire movie is on a can of cat food being scooped out. I genuinely don't know. And before we get to the plot, one other thing that this movie does over and over, this movie does that really derivative thing that horror movies have been doing since The Conjuring and before, where you have a still shot of a room, you see something, the camera pans, it comes back, and something's changed. It's just becoming one of those things that I see so often in horror movies now that I just genuinely hate. It feels cliche. It's like using the Wilhelm scream at this point. At least to me, because I overthink these things. So in the first scene, we see the girl from the cover, and she has gone into a facility, and she thinks that she's going to die and that the smiling thing is after her next. And the main character is a doctor that is trying to help her. So in this scene, at one point, the girl who's being haunted currently, she falls out of her chair and screams. She falls back onto the ground, she knocks over a vase, it shatters. It's a very loud event. Nobody in the facility comes to check on them until the doctor runs over to the phone and calls in for help, after the girl has already slit her throat. And this isn't a problem in all movies, but they try to make this world seem like it's very real. Like this is a horror in the real world, and I just don't believe in a facility like that where we see plenty of people. This woman can scream at the top of her lungs, we see this vase shatter loudly, and she still has to call for help to get people to show up. And also on the part where she cuts her own throat with the broken piece of pottery. I mean, clearly it's shocking, right? You're watching somebody slit their own throat from like Smile, like she's making basically like a grin across. And that is very shocking. The way that I look at horror is I think it's much scarier if you don't actually see what's happening. Because for most people, their imagination is going to make that thing so much worse than the filmmaker ever could. So in the shot, they show us the girl and she is cutting her own throat and the doctor is witnessing this. And the whole time we're just watching her cut herself. I think it would have been much more terrifying if she started out cutting herself and then we watched the horror on the doctor's face as this girl is cutting herself open, cut back as she's falling to the floor. And that would have actually scared me a lot more because I get to see how scared the main character is and I get to live through her experience. So as we're hearing the gurgling from her throat, then we can see the reflection in the doctor's eyes as she's just mortified. And the other thing is, even in this scene and all throughout the movie, the smiles aren't very scary in my opinion. I know I saw a lot of people talking about how scary it was, and I'm not trying to be tough here. I talk on my TikTok all the time about how movies do scare me and what movies have really scared me, what movies I chickened out of watching when I was younger, and some movies that I still won't watch to this day. So this is not coming from like some kind of macho perspective. I genuinely thought that the smiles in the film were mediocre, and there were actually times all throughout it where I burst into laughter looking at the people's smiles because it's just silly. It's like, I couldn't relate to the horror. Again, with the smiling thing, it very much feels like the Smiling Man creepypasta. And not that they own that concept or anything, and it's a creepypasta. Anybody can make anything out of it. It just didn't feel like they did it in a way that actually made me feel terror. One thing I noticed throughout this film, and it's this reoccurring thing, is that every single set, although it looks good, is way too clean and sterile. When you look at all of the walls of the facilities, every house they're in, everything looks freshly painted. Clearly this is supposed to be some kind of upscale facility. But still, even in the nicest places, you still have paint that peels, you have spots that look old, you have stains. And in this movie, there's really none of that. The film feels completely sterile and void of personality. So the main actress and the actor that's playing her husband, they have like no chemistry at all in it. I've never seen two actors with so little chemistry. And all throughout the film, her fiance character is just one of the worst characters ever. But honestly, almost every character in this movie is the worst character ever. Right after she sees this girl kill herself and she's traumatized, her husband's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't go to dinner with the people and just cancel plans. No, you just watch someone die in front of you and you're just gonna go to dinner and you think that that will distract you. She's a healthcare professional and so are the people that work around her, and nobody gives a shit about anyone's mental health. It's kind of crazy. And so we go into the scene of them at dinner and you're like, oh, it must be an important dinner. No, it's just her sister and her sister's husband. They're just complaining. So the motivations in this movie don't make any sense. And then her sister and her brother-in-law just start giving her shit for about how the main character can't go to the nephew's birthday party. His 7th birthday party. Like, who cares? She's gonna go work with people who have mental illness and she's trying to help them. The 7-year-old won't even notice if she's there or not. So I'm like underselling how annoying this was. During this scene, I was so frustrated. I genuinely almost skipped ahead. Thank God the main character screamed at them because I was about to scream at the TV. And this is right about the time where you start to get that feeling that this doesn't really feel necessarily like a professional film. It kind of feels like a student film with some professionals working on it, if that makes sense. So you have some of these things like the cinematography is pretty good, the production design's pretty good, the sound design's pretty good, but then like the story is just derivative and boring and these characters are just hateable at best. And so this is when we get our first extreme close-up and maybe the only extreme close-up of the film. I'm sure there's others that I missed. But it's of a can of cat food being served. Like, what the fuck? Within 24 hours, she's back at work. And there's no psych evaluation, there's no follow-up, there's no time off. She's just right back to work. And I just think it's highly unrealistic that they wouldn't give her a day off or at least an evaluation, but I guess she is in the US and it's so hard to get a day off for any reason. They probably would just make her come right back to work. So this cop shows up and immediately the way they position him, you can tell that he's going to be a love interest. Even though she's engaged, you can tell that there's some kind of obvious connection that the filmmakers are trying to hint at. So at this point in the film, I called it that her and her fiance would not be together by the end and that her and this guy would rekindle. And I was right. And that's the thing with bad writing, is that it telegraphs itself. They do that thing in horror films where they do a bunch of research on the computer and stuff. But in this film, every sentence that they want you to read, the main character just highlights it for no reason. And then I was like, oh, okay, she must be like copying and pasting. No, we see her highlight something and then type it out in full. So at this point, she's like walking down the hallway and she walks past this dude who's smiling. And it actually is kind of a creepy moment for a second. Once you actually get a closer look of the guy's smile, it made me start laughing. But the jump scare of her walking past the room and he's sitting there smiling is pretty effective. And I don't really like jump scares, but if you have to do a jump scare, that's a pretty good one. So at this point, her patient Carl, who's smiling, attacks her. And then he's smiling the whole time. And then he's like screaming at her, you're gonna die. But he kind of sounds like Gilbert Gottfried. And it was another point where I should have been feeling terror and I actually started laughing out loud again. You know, for all the bad things that I can say about this film, it did make me laugh a lot. And honestly, a lot of comedies don't make me laugh this much. And this was the one where I like realized that the smiles were actually kind of silly, you know, like they just aren't creepy, and that they should have really digitally enhanced their smiles and they should have like pulled them up to the corners of their eyes or something, because it just wasn't enough. And for the record, if there was somebody who was attacking me and they're smiling, like, yeah, that's super scary. But just in this horror film, the way they presented it, I just had a really hard time connecting with it. But the filmmaker kind of has to help you put yourself in that person's place. So when I see something like a guy with a Gilbert Gottfried voice like screaming at her and it sounds like the parrot from Aladdin, it's just so hard to actually be in the moment and be scared. So at this point, like, Carl has not attacked her at all. She's hallucinating it, and we see all throughout it that she has hallucinations because of this curse. But because of this, she yells for a 5150, and they come in and they just like slam this dude to the ground and like go lock him up, and she just fucks him over so bad. I just feel so bad for Carl's character. Her boss in the movie is Kal Penn from Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. But to be honest, he was kind of a weird fit for the character. It almost felt like him as an actor, he was unsure about how he should act as the character. And I'm guessing because this happens all throughout the movie with a bunch of different people, I think it's a directing problem. So then her boss like starts reaming her about the 5150 on Carl, and he's like, he's never been violent, and he thinks that she made a mistake. Well, yeah, she's in shock. She has PTSD from what happened. Of course she shouldn't be with patients. Like she gets attacked, and then like 12 hours later, he's like, yeah, get back in the cage with him. And then he's gonna like give her shit for it when that's completely a management problem. One of those moments where I was like, this is actually probably pretty realistic. Everyone starts to turn against her at this point. It's just another one of those moments where I'm like, is this supposed to be like a nightmare? Because it definitely doesn't feel realistic. But then, like most movies, he tells her to take a paid week off and she starts fighting with him. I'm so sorry, but would you fight against your boss if they went to give you a paid week off? I would be like, fuck yeah, say less. And they'd be trying to explain it and I'm already out the door. Like, if somebody says I get a paid week off, cool, I'll see you in a week. And so at this point, this is when we start to see the upside down drone shots as her life is, now upside down. And although it's a nice looking drone shot, again, it kind of makes me dizzy. So then the main character goes to buy her nephew a train set because now she's off for his birthday because she just got the week off. So she goes to get him a train set, but all the train sets are from like the 1950s, like just like all the art on them and the designs. It's very strange. So her fiance just texts her and he's like, hey, I hope you had a better day at work. I have to work late. Dude, like, I don't know why nobody in this movie is concerned with the fact that she saw somebody die. And then everyone's just acting like, oh, like, fuck, get over it. I understand this is a horror movie. I understand there's a curse and all that, and that's not realistic. But they set up a realistic world and put horror into it, so it has to be realistic at the end of the day. The supernatural aspect doesn't have to be realistic, but the world she's in should be. So her alarm goes off in the house, and so she picks up a weapon. And I was like, yes, thank you. I love smart characters. And so she goes and checks the front door and then just turns off the alarm. Doesn't check anything else. Like, she's just like, oh, we're good, we're done. It literally doesn't even make sense. She's just like, oh, that's cool. Like check what set off the alarm. You can't just close the door. Like, oh my God. So the alarm monitoring company calls her, and then while she's on the phone with them, the person on the phone gets really creepy and tells her to look behind her. The perspective of this, we're just staring at the back of her head. And I don't know about you, it's very hard for me to feel what a character's feeling when I can't see their face. And so like we're just staring at the back of her head, and I assume she's very scared. But it would have been a lot more effective if we would have again gotten a close-up of her eyes slowly turning to the side as she's trembling because she's too scared to turn around. And typically, in my opinion, in a horror film, it's not scary to see the killer's point of view or the villain's point of view. It's much scarier to see the prey's point of view. And the only time that I would say that this is not true is when it comes to stalking, right? Like Michael Myers watching somebody from afar, because that can build the tension for us that they're obviously not getting. But when it comes to an actually scary moment, I want to see the main character. I don't want to see the back of her head. So then we realize that this is another one of the hallucinations brought on by the curse. But then, her fiance's in there immediately to make her feel like, and he's like, why'd you set the alarm? And he's all rude about it. She's probably scared because she just saw somebody die. It's probably a pretty good reason. See, again, these characters, I don't know. I'm just like, who wrote these people? So at this point, they start looking for the cat, and I was like, well, fuck, they killed the cat. Of course, because in poor horror movies, they have to kill animals to make you feel something. But I was just like imagining that they were looking around and then they find the cat smiling too, like the fucking Cheshire cat. So she's like looking for her cat. And to be real, it's a very sad feeling. I've had cats throughout my life, and it is really sad when they just never come home one day. So there are points though that I wish the audio mixing was a little bit better, because there's points in the film where the screaming is about as loud as all the other audio mixing. And then there's other times where the screaming was so loud I had to turn down my TV because I thought my neighbors were gonna think someone was getting hurt. And then they come at you with a jump scare, and it's not scary at all. That's why movies like this do jump scares, is because they can't really actually invoke a sense of horror in you, so they try to do it through tricks. And then we just have another scene with her terrible fiance, and it's just very badly written, and really every single time those two characters are together, I just completely disengage with the movie because the writing is really bad at those points. She's talking to somebody and they're like, oh, you're still stuck on this thing? Like, what do you mean stuck on it? She saw someone die. And even mental health professionals in this movie don't care. To be honest, after watching the full movie, it feels like the movie is kind of anti-mental health. And then so we see that the main character, who's a therapist, also has a therapist that she hasn't been seeing again, and she starts visiting her. And they really imply in this scene through the filmmaking that not that much time has passed that she's been in here talking to her therapist. And then her therapist is just like, well, we've been talking and you don't seem like you have any delusions to me. What? The whole movie is trying to say this girl came in and they were trying to say that she was mentally ill or whatever, and she was really cursed. And now the therapist has the curse, but guess what? Now she seems mentally ill, and look at when the shoe's on the other foot. All day she works with people who are not rational. So she knows what language to avoid and how to speak rationally to someone when something irrational is happening. She never does that. She just goes straight into it. She's like, I've been cursed. Actually, maybe it's an entity or a ghost. When an actual rational person would go, I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if I'm having hallucinations or not, but these hallucinations are affecting my life and I'm scared. Can you please help me? And she never does that. She's always tries to be certain that she's the sane one. Everyone else just doesn't see it. And I don't really feel that it's indicative of the character. And so another way that she acts just completely unrealistic is she had a hallucination that she stabbed her fiance to death. And then she immediately goes to her nephew's birthday party. Yeah, you're imagining killing people and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna go hang out with a bunch of kids. You see what I mean? It's just bizarre. Just, it doesn't make any sense. When the scene starts, her nephew opens up one of his presents and I was like, oh, sweet Nerf gun. And then I realized it was like an off-brand blaster and I was just like, just throw that shit in the trash. So at this point, her dead cat is inside the present she just gave her nephew and the little boy grabs it and pulls it out. And it's like clearly CG, or maybe it was a prop, but whatever it was way too light. So this kid picks up this cat that's like half his size. I just started laughing again. I just couldn't help it. Even though it's a shocking scene, it's sad the cat's dead. And then so everyone in the room immediately assumes that she killed this cat and shoved it in a box to give to a little boy. People who have known her for years, her sister, her friends, all of these people, they just back away from her while she's freaking out and she's like, I didn't do this. And she's scared and they all just immediately assume that she did it. Because if I knew someone who worked in the mental health industry and they worked closely with patients, I would have assumed somebody had swapped out the box. I would have assumed that somebody was stalking her and that something was going on. I wouldn't immediately leap to the fact that she killed her cat and shoved it in a box. And then like she's in the emergency room and her boss just bursts in. He's like, you need to go see a therapist. He doesn't even check on her. Like, oh my God. So her fiance again, he doesn't try to get her any help. It's just like annoying because like this character, she needs help and everyone keeps just throwing it back in her face. And maybe that's what it feels like to be a mental health professional. They have a very high suicide rate. And it's because it's like, you know, it's like who watches The Watchmen? It's like the therapist, like who takes care of our therapists? They're listening to people's worst moments of their lives over and over and trying to help them make sense of it. And that leaves them feeling out of control a lot of times. And I wish the film would have been more cognizant of that because it could have made some really great commentary on that. And instead it just kind of comes across as like, mental health industry doesn't care about you, which is just such a generic look at it. Again, those moments where her character acts completely irrational, she keeps talking about it's like an evil spirit and all this stuff to people to try to get them to understand what's going on. And there are real psychological reasons that somebody could be experiencing things like that. There are documented cases of contagious hallucination, but her character is not considering any of these things. She just jumps straight to the spirit, and I don't think it's realistic at all. Or her fiance walks out on her. He basically is like, I know your mom had mental illness, you're crazy, blah, blah, blah. And just a total dick about it. And I guess like he does think that she killed the cat and that she's mentally ill, but he's also just like a slimy fuck. So there's another part where I talked about where she's doing some research and she again highlights some stuff that we're supposed to read. And then she just goes into another web browser and types it instead of copying and pasting it. So kind of the filmmaker to highlight what we're supposed to read because it would be so hard to figure it out. So she's having these hallucinations, she's creeped out and stuff, and then she just goes to sleep in her house with all her doors in her house like open and stuff, and then of course you see something creepy in the doorway. And it's just like, if you're scared, why would you leave all your doors open? That doesn't even make sense. I never sleep with my doors open. So the main character finds out that the girl that she saw kill herself, that she had seen her professor kill himself. So she goes to the widow of the now dead professor. When she goes to see the widow, Mrs. Munoz, they do another one of those very derivative horror cliches. And I'm so sick to death of seeing this horror cliche. It was the same setup and it is the same in this movie too. The main character is going to do her investigation. She just got the name of this person that holds some past key information. She walks up to the door, knocks, and then the woman steps out and she goes, Mrs. Munoz. And then they just stand there silently. And then it cuts to interior shots of the house, showing the inside of the house, but not the characters yet. And then we hear the characters talking, and then we show a wide shot of them talking. And it's supposed to imply that they've been talking for quite some time. But we skip the introductions. And I'm just so sick of seeing it. I'm so sick of that same exact setup in so many horror movies. It's so cliche now. I honestly can't stand it. When I see it in movies, it makes me want to turn the movie off immediately. This was another part where it was supposed to be shocking, and it's another autopsy scene, and I started laughing so hard because it is just ridiculous. Mrs. Munoz said that she had to identify her husband's body. Her husband's body it's on the autopsy table, and all of a sudden they just whip down the sheet. And you see his face, and like he's beaten himself, so like half his face is like hanging off. It's very gruesome. But I started laughing because I was like, it was like a nervous, like, who would do this? And this movie just feels like a fever dream, and not even in a good way. And then it was right about at that moment I realized that that was Carla from Scrubs. So luckily the professor that beat himself to death was also an amazing artist, so it shows all of the art he's made of the things that were following him. And then they talk about how his brother died in an accident, but then they show art that he made, and he has like a bullet hole in his head, which I thought was just, again, kind of like almost like a morbid joke. The widow says that her husband, he killed himself after he saw another woman kill herself. And she goes, oh, but the people don't know about that because the news didn't report on the fact that a woman had already killed herself, that he had witnessed a suicide right before. And then the main character goes like, wait, he saw a woman kill herself right before? And then the widow's like, yeah, I assumed you knew that. And it's like, how the f would she know that if it wasn't reported on? At some points, this feels like a first or second draft of the script. Of course, she ends up, because she has no place to go because her fiance's being a dick, she ends up going back to the cop's house that it was her ex or whatever. And on his wall, he has this really interesting window, but I couldn't help thinking that it looks like he lives inside of a colon. So then the cop he starts showing her the chain of people that have been killing themselves, and some of them, they have footage from it, and it's just like on this laptop that he can access from home, and I don't know if that's realistic, but that seems kind of weird to me. And then we're watching like CCTV footage of people. It's just like the most crisp CCTV footage you can imagine. Stores streaming 4K footage. It's so funny. And it would have been a lot scarier if the CCTV footage would have been skipping worse, only seeing every like 2 seconds, and it's like grainy footage. And then she asked the cop if he has like a printer and stuff. And if I were him, I'd be like, you need to go. You are a ticking time bomb. You're gonna start smiling any moment. I don't wanna be around you. But I guess he like loves her or whatever, so I guess that kind of makes sense. If you've seen the movie The Ring, you recognize that this is way too similar to The Ring. She's working with this guy, he's helping her do this kind of background detective work, and then she goes and drives out to this lake house so that she can do more of her investigation. And it's like, it's just so close in the footsteps of The Ring that I couldn't help but think about it over and over. Even the shot of her in the car looks shockingly similar to The Ring. And that's not the only shot in this movie that looks very similar to another movie. And then they try to do an intervention, and the main character just kind of freaks out and acts irrational again. But she just keeps talking like her patients at the beginning of the film, and of course she's surprised when that doesn't actually get her what she wants. And again, it's a rational person would act rational even in an irrational time. And she tries to convince her sister that something's going on by like, hey, an entity's following me. And instead of like, hey, here's police evidence of a string of dozens of people that killed themselves all within a span of 7 days after they saw the last person, and give her the evidence, her sister would look at that and be like, oh, maybe bring the cop with you so you can be like, hey, this cop also agrees with me. Oh, and again, the screenwriting is terrible in this, so they can't figure out how to make this character make logical decisions, but still not get what she wants. So they just have the main character, she pulls out pictures of dead people and starts showing it to her sister. Like, what the fuck? And throughout the movie, nobody tries to get her any kind of mental help at all. And literally and metaphorically, people just slam doors in her face. Her sister's like, you're mentally ill like mom, and then wants nothing to do with her. Okay, so I do have to say though, this part after this, it was a jump scare. And it was probably one of the best jump scares I've ever seen in my life. It freaked me out so bad, and it was like midday when I watched this. So she's sitting in her car freaking out after she has the fight with her sister. Her sister walks up, and you're like, oh, okay, she's gonna knock on the window and reconcile. She knocks, and then her head falls down and looks at her, and woof. It was genuinely a scary moment. It was very well done. And then like she starts freaking out in the car, realizing it's a hallucination. She's so upset. But then we show her nephew, who she gave the dead cat to, and he's just staring at her from the window, traumatized. And it's so much like that scene in Detroiters when he's wearing the Slipknot mask and banging on the window and those guys walking the dog see him. So she finds out that the only person who broke the chain of suicides was somebody who went and murdered somebody. And I'm like, but she already murdered her cat, so doesn't that count? This is that point where in movies like this that I don't need all the answers, but I feel like the filmmakers don't have all the answers. So I start to wonder things like, what if somebody went to kill themselves in front of you in the smile thing and you just didn't look at them? So, you know, she pretends to be a reporter. She goes in to see the guy who murdered somebody instead of committing suicide. Prison walls perfectly painted, but we have like dirty glass. Everything's so sterile. And so the guy basically tells her that to break the curse, you have to transfer it to somebody else. So you have to murder somebody violently and you have to make sure there's a witness. And then whatever this curse is passes to the witness. And that it's like trauma based. And so you have to make it very traumatic. She accidentally lets it slip that she's cursed right now. And so he starts freaking out because she just brought this thing back to him that he tried to get rid of. So he starts yelling at her, telling her to get away. I don't blame him at all. I would have flipped my shit on her too and told her to leave. So there's like a moment with production design when she gets home where there's a letter in her mailbox that's sitting by the door and it says last chance on the mail. Kind of clever production design. Clearly they're trying to communicate that she's, you know, in her last moments, her last day or whatever. But I think that they just made the lettering far too big. They made it a little too obvious. I think they should have hid it a little bit more. So it would have felt a little more exciting to find it. I felt like they placed it almost in the center of the screen, so it didn't really feel as much of like an Easter egg as it should have been. Then there's a scene where her therapist comes over, they're having a session, and then partway through her therapist calls her on the phone. So she realizes that she's having another hallucination. And then the therapist on the couch starts smiling and comes over and kind of attacks her and growly talks at her and stuff. When she got the phone call, I thought that was very scary. I was very into it. And then it kind of just fell apart for me. And every time somebody does the smile, I just keep thinking that they should have done more with the smiles. They're just kind of cheesy. So then she goes and she's gonna pass on the curse. So she goes to that guy, Carl, who she 5150'd earlier, her patient, proceeds to just stab him, but then he starts laughing and stuff and you realize she's in another hallucination and she wakes up. So it's about this point when you start to realize that this movie's a little bit similar to Oculus as well. Her having these hallucinations that sometimes take minutes. And I realized at this point in the film that the score is not very good for the film. It didn't stand out in any way and it didn't make me feel any emotion all throughout it. So then she like is talking to her boss and she's like, I need to be alone. And then she's like, I need to be alone. And it's supposed to be like this epiphany moment, but it's just like a really bad one. It just, oh man, it just feels silly. She's talking like she's exhausted all of her options. And that was a very obvious option. And that was one that I was thinking earlier too, like what if nobody's around? And this is why I don't like badly written characters, is because I actually root against them. At this point, I genuinely didn't care what happened to the main character because she didn't make good decisions. So how do you root for someone like that? So she could go anywhere, right, to be alone in the world and to face this thing. So does she go to the middle of the forest? Does she go out on a boat? Does she go maybe in a cave somewhere? No, she goes to her childhood home, her mentally ill, abusive mother. That's like the scariest place she could go while facing this thing. And we find out that the main character, she's actually the reason that her mom died. Her mom was ODing accidentally, and she was scared of her mom, didn't like her, so she just left and let her mom OD. Then she prepares this house. The plan is, I'm guessing, to just sit still and wait, but then she, I guess, gets bored, so she just grabs a lantern and starts wandering around the dark house. And then she sees her mom in the bedroom, and then she just starts talking to her like it's actually her mom. And I was like, you just forgot the plan immediately. Like the plan just is completely out the window in the first 5 seconds. Oh, ghost of my mom must be my mom. If I saw one of my dead relatives, there's nothing that could convince me that's them because they're dead and I know that. So it's gonna be like, I don't know, I just don't understand this character at all. And then she just like has like a conversation and like a growing moment with this ghost mom, and it's just, I honestly don't even know what to say at some points in this movie because it's just so stupid. The whole idea of them accidentally taking the plot of The Ring, you know what, The Ring is very similar in some ways to Changeling, which is similar to other movies, so I could see how it's like, okay, maybe I'm just connecting it. The shot from It Follows where the giant follows her into the room, it almost looks exactly the same. This movie is just a mashup of other better movies. I don't understand how you can take all these great ingredients and make a worse meal. I mean, I'm not for taking other people's art and mashing it up. I don't think it's right. And I'm not making any accusations. This is just my opinion after watching it. But I mean, I don't know how anybody can watch this movie and not see all of these other films in it. And then we have another cliche. It's like, oh, we're looking into the darkness. Guess what? It's behind you. It's right over your shoulder. So then, you know, again, another cliche. She's like, wait, if this is my mind that you're in, then I can hurt you. So then she like breaks the thing's arm and sets it on fire with the lantern. And she walks out of the place. It's burning down. The roof is collapsing behind her. And this part actually looks kind of cool when the house is collapsing. But then all of a sudden, if you look at the roof, it just collapses in like one big chunk because it's just like one chunk of board instead of like how a roof's actually built where it would tear apart. She goes back to the cop's place and she's apologizing. And at this point I was like, this movie is not good. There's going to be another twist. Then the twist is that this guy Joel is actually the entity. And all of a sudden we go back and she's still inside her childhood home. She never left. The whole fire sequence and fighting the entity was all a hallucination. And again, it's hard not to think of Oculus during this. And then Joel pulls up and she realizes there's another person there that she's gonna transfer it to. So she like screams and starts backing away, but it's like, tell him with your words, go, Joel, get in your car and drive away as fast as you can. That's all she had to say. But no, there was actually a really cool monster design moment here where the creature rips its face open and you can see that it has a bunch of jaws. Like it has like 12 or more jaws. And I thought that actually looked really cool. And then the monster crawls down her fucking throat. It just crawls down her throat. So then the cop guy Joel shows up, he gets inside the house and he sees that she has dumped kerosene all over herself. And what does he do? Because this guy knows about the curse. He knows that if she starts smiling, she's gonna kill herself. He sees she's covered in kerosene, so what does he do? Nothing. He just stands there and watches her set herself on fire. Like he literally could have like tackled her out the window of the kitchen. And that's just literally the end of the film. This twist, I think with more competent filmmaking could have been effective, but the way that it's presented, it's not really interesting. And also the reason that they take this ending is because if they would have done what was the more logical ending where she was gonna pass on the curse, but that would have been far too similar to The Ring, and the rest of the movie is way too similar to The Ring. So clearly they couldn't have the same ending, so they did this one where they twist and they movie. It just ends right there. And clearly they're setting up a sequel for this because he's going to be the next in the chain. But it's just annoying. I hate stories like this where you just have this circular event that keeps happening and everyone's caught in a cycle. I actually talk about this if you go watch my Vivarium review. Short films and feature films are very different and you can't have the same plot. And when you are making a feature film, you can show a cycle happening and the main character can be in a cycle and that can be entertaining. But in a movie like this, a feature film, having a main character be caught in a cycle that all of these other people have been, that's not interesting. A real interesting main character breaks cycles. They don't participate in them. I honestly just, at the end of the film, I was like, it's kind of crazy that like she just had to kill somebody and obviously she doesn't want to kill somebody. But like there are horrible people in the world. I figure she would have just gone and do like a Dexter kind of thing. But even the other guy who was in prison for killing that woman so he could break the cycle, he just went and murdered some lady. I was like, bro, go find like a killer that slipped through the judicial system. Do that. Like it just, and so ultimately I really don't think it's a very good film. I wouldn't recommend it to people. I don't like to straight up deter people from ever watching art because art's subjective. You might watch this movie and absolutely love it. It lifts so many elements from other films. If I had to give this a rating, I'd probably give it like a 3 out of 10. And if they make a sequel, I will not watch it. And so while I was watching the film, I had this feeling, I was like, I bet you this is based off a short film. Because like I said, this film, it follows the idea of seeing a character stuck in a cycle, and it's called Laura Hasn't Slept. As far as I can gather, the main character in the short film is the actress who kills herself in the opening scene of Smile. So essentially, Smile is a continuation of the short film, which I can really appreciate. As a filmmaker, it's incredible when a filmmaker is able to take a short and make it into a feature. But the thing that my criticism ultimately comes back to is, in my opinion, this film takes far too much from other movies. And it's okay to be inspired by films. We all are. We can't help it. But what you can help is when you're doing something that you see is a direct copy of something else, change it. I wouldn't watch this again. Well, I want to thank you all so much for watching this review. If you check out more content on my channel, I like to review different things such as movies, film gear, literature, pretty much anything that I feel like talking about that day. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget on your way out today to hit the like, subscribe, and that notification bell. You can also check out my TikTok where I do a lot of content like this. And if you want to see some of my content early before it hits YouTube, head on over to my Patreon where once a month I make a video deep dive about a movie or book. I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.